We have done quite a bit of talking, so in this video, we're going to change things and get our hands dirty by writing out a little bit of code. We're going to learn how to make a simple and basic request off to the Anthropic API. I'm going to walk you through 4 setup steps. So step 1, we're going to open up a Jupyter notebook and install the Anthropic Python SDK along with a package called python.env. To get started, I'm going to open up a notebook on my own. I've already added in some comments to my notebook just to guide myself through this process. In step 1 up here, I'm going to add in a magic install command. So %pip install anthropic python.env. If you're writing your notebook inside of Visual Studio Code as I am, you might notice a red syntax error coming from the % over here. If you see that syntax error, it is totally fine. You can ignore it. Once I've written out this command, I'm going to run it to install these packages. I'm then going to clear the output just so you can see what's going on my screen a little bit more easily. Next, we are going to use that python.env package to store and load our API key. As a reminder, I put in some directions on creating an API key in the previous lecture. So if you did not create an API key, I would encourage you to go back to the previous lecture and find those directions. To store this key inside of my editor, I'm going to create a file in the same directory as my notebook with a very special name. I'm going to name this file .env. And then inside of here, I'm going to place the API key that I generated a moment ago. I will write out exactly anthropic _API _key, and then an equal sign. And then inside of double quotes, I will put in that key. As a quick side note, the whole reason that we are creating this file and putting our key inside of here is so that we can now ignore this file when we are making use of version control, so that we do not accidentally commit this file, say to Git, and then accidentally push it up to some public repository where anyone can see this file. So again, if you're making use of Git or a similar version control system, I would encourage you to make sure that you ignore this file anytime you are committing your work. Now, back inside my notebook, I can securely load up that environment variable. Then on to step number 3, where we will create our API client using the Anthropic package. Inside this cell, I'm also going to declare a variable name model. This will be a string. It's going to contain the name of the model that we want to run inside of the Anthropic API. We are going to use Claude Sonnet 4. Now on to the last step, where we are going to actually make a request using that client that we just created. Before we write out any code, however, I want to show you a little bit of terminology, just some stuff that's going to make things a little bit easier down the line. So the first thing to understand here is that we are going to access Claude by using the create function inside the Anthropic SDK. This function requires 3 different keyword arguments: a model, max tokens, and messages. The model keyword argument is just going to be the name of the model we want to run. We already defined that variable ahead of time in our previous cell. The second required keyword argument is max _ tokens. This sets a maximum budget on the number of tokens that Claude can generate. For example, if we pass in a max tokens of 1000, if Claude tries to generate anything longer than that, then the generation will be automatically stopped, and we will receive back the first 1000 tokens that were generated. One thing to note here is that Claude doesn't try to target your number of max tokens. In other words, Claude won't try to write a response of 1000 tokens, it'll just write whatever response it thinks is appropriate. And as such, you should really view max tokens as being like a safety mechanism to ensure that you're not generating too much text. Finally, messages. And this is the part that I really want to focus on because messages are going to be a huge focus for us in the coming videos. To understand what messages are all about, I would like you to think back to the chat application we discussed a moment ago. So a user might type in some question to Claude and then expect to get an answer back. The messages that we're talking about when we pass these things into this create function are meant to represent exchanges like this. There are 2 types of messages, a user message and an assistant message. User messages contain text that we want to feed into Claude. The content inside of a user message is text that either a user or you and I as developers have authored. So in other words, a user message will contain text that has been written by some person. The second type of message is an assistant message. These messages contain text that have been produced by a model and sent back to us. Now, at this point, I think we have enough knowledge to at least make our first request. So let's do that and then discuss messages a little bit more. Back inside of my notebook, in the very last cell, I'm going to declare a variable of message, and that will come from client, messages, create. And I'm going to pass in those different arguments that we just discussed. So I'll put in a model of model, a max tokens, and I'll use 1000 here, which I think is definitely a safe limit, and then a list of input messages. So inside of here, I'm going to put in one single user message, and it will contain my question or my query that I want to send off to Claude. To create a user message, we'll create a dictionary that will have a role of user and then a content that will contain the actual string that we want to send into Claude. So in this case, I'm going to ask Claude to define quantum computing with something like, what is quantum computing? Answer in one sentence. Then I'm going to run this. It will take a moment or two to run because we are actually accessing Claude here. And then in the next cell down, I'm going to try to print out the message variable. We'll see what we get. All right, so inside of here, we can see that there's a lot of stuff coming out, but noticeably, we have a definition right around here of what quantum computing actually is. So inside of this message variable that we got back, our text is kind of deeply nested. We very often want to get just the text that Claude has generated, and very often we don't really care about any of these other properties that are contained inside this thing. So to access just the generated text, we would write out message.content0.text, like so. And if I run that cell again, now I'll see just the generated text and nothing else.